Hi everyone, my name is James. Welcome back to Kingspan Woodworking. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools, just kind of an extension of last week's video. I talked about squares last week, and a lot of people asked me, some were disappointed, and I got a lot of emails saying, they like the Kynex squares, but they like to use something that's at 45 degrees, but Kynex does make a 45 degree tool. This is the Kynex, and this basically I use to square the blade or put the blade at 45 degrees. This is very precise. They also have the digital things that you can attach to the saw blade, and it's an inclinometer, so as the saw blade tilts over, you measure the amount of degrees. But if you want something exactly at 45, this is pretty handy. And it's also a good way to test your inclinometer and make sure that it's working just right as well. And they make slightly bigger versions of these too. These are both just 45 degree squares by Kynex. Actually, this one's not Kynex, but it's a very similar brand. It's got German brand engineering and marking guides. So that's those, and they also make a couple of other interesting things too. Kynex does. They make this square. This is a 30-60-90 square. This is made by Kynex. It's stainless steel. It's pretty heavy duty, and they make a 45-90 square. And I use these quite a bit for layout also. So if I need something that's bigger at 45 degrees, there's no lip on here. So it's not like I'm going to take this and put it on the edge of a piece of wood like you could a speed square. But it's good for layout on top of the wood. So again, this is a 30-60-90. So we've got a 30 degree angle here, 60 degree angle here, and of course this is the 90. And these things are pretty handy. Now I do a lot of glue up with these, measuring things. I get glue on them. The glue gets corroded on here, sticks, causes problems. If that happens to you, that's a really easy fix with a stainless steel square. I usually will just take something like a 180 grit sandpaper and literally just sand these, and they'll come out nice and smooth. You can sand these things, and then I spray them with lacquer. So I do the same with my, you can spray your cast iron surfaces the same way. You can use lacquer, you can even use a water-based polyurethane, but the lacquer will keep these things protected. Even the water-based polyurethane, it dries so fast that it doesn't have a chance to rust or cause the metal to oxidize. And of course, they all say stainless, but nobody uses a very high-end stainless like a 440 that's not going to rust. They're all a little bit cheaper of a grade of stainless, so if they stayed wet for an extended period of time, of course they would rust. But I keep a finish on these. So like I said, just a nitrocellulose-based lacquer or a water-based polyurethane. Both of those are acceptable. And that's these layout squares. And I thought I might just talk a little bit more about layout because quite a few people had asked me what we do and what we use for laying out our joints. And those are obviously very common. But another thing that we use is what's called a double square. And I don't know how many people are familiar with these, but these things are invaluable. So it works a lot like a square, but it's called a double square because you've got a square here and you've got a square here. So you can do two different things with it. So if I'm going to lay out, say, anytime you go to cut a joint, you're going to lay it out first. Lay it out means basically you're going to put all the markings on here in pencil before you start cutting wood. So you kind of want to know what your joint looks like. So we might take and set the diameter of this or set the distance of this just so, and then we would make a mark, and we could do the same over here with the gauge, make a mark. Or let's say if we need to make a mark a specific distance in from the edge, we can do that, make a distance in from the edge, and then we can use the other side of this to draw it square across the whole piece. So that's pretty handy to have. These usually come in sets. This is made by eye gauging. These are great. And usually I use it because I've got, so if this were going to be a little miniature table, I've got the rail and I've got the leg. So I've got to lay out my mortise in here, and I've got to lay out my tenon cut on here before I make any cuts. Okay, so one thing, if I'm going to lay out, say, my mortise and this thing, digital calipers are a really good thing to have. And as always, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to all of these things in the description down below in case there's something that you see here that you'd like to go and look at. I get most of these from Amazon. They tend to have some of the best prices out there. But I'm not going to put a link to this. I bought this before I knew any better. This is a Mirutoyo caliper. This is a really good caliper. I think it's good to like the 10,000th of an inch, which is just dumb and overkill for woodworking. So you don't want to go and spend $160 on calipers when you can buy a set for $40, which works great. I love all of eye gauging stuff, and I've used the eye gauging calipers. I don't have them here right now, or I'd show you a picture of them, but it's basically identical to this. But I'm going to put a link to that in there because unless you just want to waste money, you don't necessarily want to buy this. I'm not saying it's bad. It's fantastic, but you don't need 1/10,000th of an inch accuracy for any woodworking stuff. Even the 1/1000th of an inch accuracy is overkill. But let's say I want to lay this out here to make a mortise and tenon joint. So maybe I want my tenon to be here. So I want to make a layout, say 3/8 of an inch in from the edge on both sides so that it's equal. Well, this is handy because I'll set this here at 3/8 of an inch. I'll lock that down, and then I'll use that. You see how calipers work is the bottom sticks out by the same amount that this is open. So I'll lay this out here, and I will bring this up until this just touches right there. You see how this thing slides, so I'll bring it up until it just touches right there. I'll hold that in place, and then I'll tighten that. And now it's that exact distance. It's exactly 3/8 of an inch. And now I'll bring that over here. Let me do it like that. And I can trace that here, and this is going to be my layout for part of the mortise. And I'll do the same thing over here. All right, so I know in both cases I'm exactly 3/8 of an inch in from the outside edge. So that it's nice and symmetrical. And then I want to come a specific distance down. Maybe I want to come a 1/4 inch down from the top. So I'll just run this down to 0.250 and get this down to 1/4 of an inch right there. That's 249. I don't know if you can see that there. That's only 1/1000th off of 0.250. You might go crazy sometimes trying to hit it exact. So 249, of course, is plenty good enough. And then I'll loosen this up. We'll adjust this until it just touches right there. That's 0.250. And we'll make that mark here. That's 0.250. That's the top of my mortise, which is going to be taken away. And let's say maybe I want the bottom of it. Let's take a look at this, what we have here. Let's see, that is 2.5 inches, so maybe I want to come down 2¼ inches, so I'll set this at 2.25, and maybe we'll use the larger one for that. Set that at 2.25 right there. And we'll set that at 2.25. Now, I can also use this as a straight edge here. Let's see. To bring this line down. And same thing over here. And this is the area which I'm going to chisel out or use my mortising hollow chisel mortise or something to take this out. This will be the mortise that I'm going to take out. So all these kind of work in combination. It's ideal to have a set of calipers so that you can get some exact marks and transfer those measurements to your double squares, and you'll use the double squares that way. If you are going to chisel, there is something that's better than just pencil marking it, and that would be to, say, use a marking gauge, because a marking gauge is going to put a groove in. Let's say if I want to cut this with a marking gauge, that's what this is here. And you can see the marking gauge, it goes in and out. So if I want to set a distance on my marking gauge, I'd use the same thing, probably the calipers, to set this. There's numbers on it, but they're real hard to read. And this is called a wheel marking gauge because this little wheel turns, and it's very sharp, and so it's going to gouge into the wood. So you just do this nice and slow. And can you see the line that's forming right there? Hopefully you can see that line that's forming there. Sometimes it's not real obvious, so I can just follow that line with a pencil mark. But that line has basically scored the fibers along that edge. So if I have to clean that out with a chisel, then I can chisel right back up to that line, and it gives me a nice clean line. So a marking gauge is just a fantastic tool for that. There's a Japanese marking gauge too. I think that's called a kakuri, and this particular marking gauge has got a double, two things that move on the marking gauge. So two marks at once. So if I'm going to lay out here for my tenon to go in there, for example, I might do both of these at the same time, and I'll show you what that looks like. So anytime you're going to use a marking gauge, you want to start slow. You don't want to try to apply a whole bunch of pressure and dig through all at once. You just basically start slow and just drag it across, and you want to drag it across a number of times in order to gradually get the cut deeper and deeper. There's that, and in case you can't see it, there's that line. And there's that line. So the marking gauge will, if you have a double marking gauge or one of the Japanese ones, you can do something like that. It's kind of a pain to set those up, but even if you just used it as a single gauge, that's no problem. And here's how this works. You just loosen this, and then these slide out. They'll slide separately, or they'll slide very close together. But if you just want to use one, you just pull the other one in, leave it tucked in, and then tighten the one for where you want it. Here again, if you're not doing a lot of hand tool woodworking, you wouldn't necessarily need these. And if you are, you may know more about hand tool woodworking than me, so maybe that's not something you're interested in. But I do a lot of my marking with pencils because I do not too much chisel work. I do some cleanup with chisel work, but I don't do most of my primary cutting with chisel work. So the two of these, however, are every single job. Every job that I use, no matter what, I use the double squares. They're not very expensive, and it's a valuable tool to have. Another thing, you know, if you are making a mark, a lot of times I make a mark like if I had to put a tenon, let's say I've got to put a tenon in the edge of this, and I know my distance down to make the tenon is, let's say, here. Well, maybe let's make it here because this will be a pretty deep tenon. But I have to run this around the edge of the board all the way around, and that relies on my ability to see. It relies on my ability to see where this line is to get it to line up perfectly right there. And that's kind of a pain. And so for that, I use a saddle square. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but these are great. So we get that to line up there, and then I don't have to move the square because it marks both sides of the board at the same time. Then I can rotate that around again. I'll tend to put my pencil on the line there. So yep, that's there. And then here, same thing here. I'll get it to where it just touches my pencil there, and then I transfer it there. So, and that gives us a line all the way around the board, and that's perfect. So saddle square, really cheap tool, an aluminum tool usually. It doesn't have to be super precise. This will also help you if you want to lay, let's say if this had to be a miter cut, for example. If I was going to miter the end, you can see how this is chamfered, this particular tool. I'll bring it up to the edge there and cut and draw it there. And so maybe I'm going to make that cut at 45 degrees. So that allows me to line up straight with here and then bring my 45 degrees down that way. So this is a pretty essential tool. It's called a saddle square. And I would definitely get one of those if you're going to do some work. Let me show you one more tool here while we're at it, I suppose. And that's, a lot of times we have to lay out something big, like we've got a piece of wood, maybe a really ugly piece of wood like this, and we've got to get this side square to this side because there's a rough cut over here. A lot of people, the first thing they'll do is they'll reach for this, and I do it too. I'm guilty of that. You reach for something like this because then we can get a straight line here. The problem is this is a rafter square, and this is meant for just rough construction like on homes. And you can imagine cutting 2x10s or 2x6s, 2x8s. You just don't have to be that precise. And so this is not a tool that you should use if you're going to do some fine woodworking. If you need something approximately square, that's okay. But if you need something that's accurate, then you have to buy an accurate square. And that's something like this. And they're not outrageous. I think they're about 70 bucks. It's not woodpeckers, or it might be really expensive, but 70 bucks for a high precision, large size square. It's got the seat here, so you can hold that against there, and now you can draw a line that you're sure, is accurate to just maybe a couple thousandths of an inch. And then when you trim that off, then you have exactly a right angle here with 90 degrees. That's important to have. So a large square to replace a rafter square is important. The 45 degree I guess they call them 45-degree squares. Of course, there's nothing square about them, but the 45-degree marking guides, and then the two different ones that I use for layout, the 45, 45, 90. You've probably seen a lot of artists or drafters, they use these. They're very common. This is a 30, 60, 90, and then a 45, 45, 90. And then, of course, the regular marking gauges, the Japanese style, or the wheel marking gauge. Those are great. And then the double squares, which come in a pack. These are by eye gauging. These are ones I would recommend. I've had a few different double squares in my life, and these seem to be the best. These hold up. These have held up for a very long time, and they're still perfectly accurate. They're very good tools, and they're pretty handy. They store away. They don't take up much space. And of course, you need some calipers if you want. I'll go ahead and put the link to the Mitutoyo calipers down below, but you certainly don't have to buy these. I would recommend, if you just do woodworking, buy the eye gauging. Don't get the really cheap no-name Chinese brand. There's really no telling how accurate they are, but I think if you get the regular eye gauging brand, they're guaranteed to 1/1000th of an inch. That's more than you need. You don't need to go to a 10,000th of an inch like that. I think that's it. That's kind of all I wanted to show you guys today. Kind of an extension of last week's video on squares, and we've just extended it into some angle stuff and some layout tools. So hope that helps. Thanks for watching. Bye.